It's no secret the US is setting itself up for an economic catastrophe that will be unparalleled to anything we have ever seen in the history of the world. Despite what the mainstream media and financial experts keep preaching, the US is not in a recovery, and we are headed for a complete collapse of our system here in the States. If we are in a recovery, why has median household income been in decline for the past 5 years in a row? If we are really in a recovery, why do only 28% of Americans like the direction this nation is headed? To top it all off, why are many big box retailers shutting their doors across America? The sad reality is that the US is not in a recovery, and we are headed towards a disastrous economic collapse. It could happen in a number of ways, and there is no telling how it might happen, but I do know that we are in need of a complete restructuring of our monetary system. We simply can't keep this Ponzi scheme up for much longer, and as soon as the financial experts realize this, the bottom will drop out of the market. As it stands today, we have more debt, both individually and as a nation, than any other empire in the history of the world. In fact, world debt levels have risen $30 trillion since 2007, and the US national debt has jumped $6.89 trillion since President Obama took office. In addition, the too big to fails have gotten 37% larger since 2007, and all we can do now is sit back and watch as the colossal derivatives bubble pops before our very eyes. It is self-evident that our economy here in the US is more fragile than it has ever been in its history. Of course you don't need a crystal ball to see that, all you have to do is look at the data. So without wasting any more of your time, here are 5 reasons why an economic collapse is inevitable, and near the end of this video I'll explain where to position your investments to keep them safe during the coming time of crisis. Reason number 1: a reckless monetary policy. The Federal Reserve, the central bank that issues our currency, is completely out of control. The Fed controls the money supply, and this means they can literally print as much money as they want. Today, the Fed is currently printing $75 billion per month, and some economists, such as Peter Schiff, suspect that number is actually much higher. Through a process known as quantitative easing, the Fed continually buys up US Treasury bonds at record low interest rates, and then the federal government uses some of that money to pay off its debt, through a process known as debt monetization. Of course, this can only end in inflation, as the more money we print, the less purchasing power each dollar has. For the time being, however, we are able to export a majority of our inflation to other nations, since large industrial creditors, such as China, are willing to hoard trillions in reserves. Unfortunately, all of this will eventually come to an end, and if interest rates don't rise, the dollar will simply collapse under the weight of hyperinflation, runaway inflation, when creditors finally get smart enough to dump the dollar. Reason number 2: impatient creditors. As we just mentioned, large industrial nations, such as China, are willing to hoard trillions in reserves, which is primarily why we are able to get away with this monetary heist. But what happens when China gets fed up with us exporting our inflation to them, and decides to drop the dollar? All hell will break loose. If a large industrial nation like China suddenly decided to dump their dollar reserves, we would see a rapid rise in the cost of consumer goods here in America, or quite simply, we would see runaway inflation. This would happen because if China were to ever drop the dollar, all of the reserves they have on hand would come washing back to US shores. It doesn't take an economist to figure out the rest. All of those dollars would cause consumer prices to rise dramatically in a very short period of time, leading to hyperinflation. The end result would be an economic collapse. Of course, there are those who say it could never happen, but recently China announced that it is going to stop stockpiling US dollars. Reason number 3. Too much debt. If a large industrial nation like China doesn't decide to drop US reserves. Another scenario is, if China suddenly decided to stop buying US debt. What would happen then? First, we would see an immediate sell-off in the dollar, as investors would move their assets to safer investments, such as gold, silver and other commodities. Then we would see the Fed dramatically raise interest rates, in a feeble attempt to encourage interest in the dollar. Unfortunately for America, the hike in interest rates is unsustainable, simply because our national debt is too large. Once interest rates hike beyond 1%, a default on our debt is very likely, and we could quite possibly see America turn into the next Greece. Currently, interest rates are at 0%, so a minor shift in the markets is all it would take for this to occur. Reason number 4. Monetization of debt. We already know that the Fed loves printing money. As we just mentioned above, we are currently exporting our inflation so we can pay our debts, as well as buying cheap consumer goods from nations like China. We are still able to maintain a decent standard of living here in the US, simply because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. We also know that, if a large industrial nation ever decided to drop the dollar, we would experience hyperinflation on an epidemic scale. But right now, let's actually take a look at a real-life example of just how destructive debt monetization can be. During World War I, Germany had amassed a huge national debt, along with reparation payments from countries such as France for the rebuilding of Europe. Germany could have paid its creditors back over time, but instead they decided to pay back their creditors sooner, with devalued Deutschmarks. So the Reichsbank, the German central bank, started printing obscene amounts of money, and in just 5 short years the price for a loaf of bread rose from 1 German mark to 200 billion German marks. This is just one example of what can happen when a nation is too loose with its money supply. A more recent example is Zimbabwe, which experienced runaway inflation in 2008. Reason number 5. Fiat money. Last but not least, let us not forget that the dollar is a fiat currency, meaning it is backed by absolutely nothing. The average lifespan of a fiat currency is 27 years, and the one thing that has kept the dollar going this long is the fact that it is the world reserve currency. Of course, this cannot last forever, as every single major empire in the history of the world has collapsed, rather it be the Roman Empire, or the British Empire. Since the dollar was taken off the gold standard in 1971 by President Richard Nixon, we have seen a massive devaluation of our currency. The devaluation is likely to grow worse, as the Fed ramps up the printing presses in a last-ditch effort to create economic growth. Unfortunately, what these economic experts fail to realize is that prosperity is never created by the printing press. Indeed, if a nation chooses to live by the printing press, it will die by the printing press. Where to position your investments to protect yourself and your family? There are numerous places you can put your money to protect yourself from what's to come. The first investment I strongly recommend is gold and silver, since precious metals have always been used as a storehouse of value during economic crisis. Other options include overseas stocks and currencies outside of the dollar, such as the yuan, Hong Kong dollar, Australian dollar, and Swiss franc. I strongly believe that these currencies will prosper during a dollar collapse. The most important piece of advice I can give you is to get out of the dollar, and that means now. There's no telling when this currency crisis will take place, or when the US economy will collapse, but what we do know is that it could happen at any time, so it's better to be prepared in advance than be completely caught off guard when it happens. I hope this has opened your eyes to the reality of where our economy stands, and just how fragile it really is. The United States and global economy as a whole are set for a major restructuring in the very near future, and that could include a complete restructuring of our debt, or our monetary system as a whole. And rather it comes in the form of a currency crisis, or a default on our debt, the results of either will be catastrophic.